about the draft. I think there's no secret that offensive line, I think, the wide receiver position, depending upon how they view the likelihood of trading A.J. Brown or not is going to be addressed. Certainly tight end, it's a position of depth that I think they can get to in the second, maybe even the third day and get someone significant. Because again, Goddard had a fine receiving year, but getting Johnny Munt to be more the blocker can help maybe take that responsibility away from him as much, where he doesn't have to do that. But I think that's where the focus of this draft is going to come. How do you view that?
I think you're 100% right. I think this to me is what makes both the draft and this coming season so interesting to me, because this season won't necessarily be a transition for the Eagles, but they're in the midst of making one now. We saw what happened on the defensive side of the ball when they were able to get Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis and Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, and the difference that those guys were able to make and the direction that those selections were able to take the franchise. Now you've got to try to do the same thing in the offensive side of the ball. You've got to try to replenish and replace a number of players who will be here this year, but whose futures, I think it's fair to say, are in doubt. And I think Jalen is on that list. Obviously, Lane Johnson is on that list. A.J. Brown, assuming he's back, is on that list. Landon Dickerson is on that list. You have a number, Goddard, obviously, in the tight end position, as you said, you have a number of spots where they're going to need to bring in young, inexpensive players who can perform right away, or at least within the first year or two after they draft them. And they were able to do that in 2024, and it led to a Super Bowl. And now they've got to do the same sort of thing, and they haven't done it on this side of the ball in a long, long time. I think you're 100% right. I would look at them replenishing the offensive line first and foremost. We know that that's what Howie believes to be kind of the center, the fulcrum of an entire offense. Tight end, I think, falls under that. That's been a position where they've traditionally been strong over time, whether you're talking about Goddard or Zach Ertz or Brett Selleck or back in the day, Chad Lewis and L.J. Smith. They've always been, when they've been good, their tight ends have been good. And then you got to look at wide receiver, because you don't know what A.J. Brown's future is. You need somebody to line up opposite Devontae Smith. And they need some game breakers out there.
Another transition, you got me to A.J. Brown. I think this is probably a good time to talk about it. Clearly there's a reset in terms of how the Eagles are conversing with other teams about him at this point. As I was told at the combine and had written at the time, that those next 10 days before the start of free agency were going to be the key ones in terms of whether the Eagles are going to move him at that time. And they were going to make a decision whether it's something we're going to do now or something that we weren't. I don't think it's any secret that the Patriots had conversations with them. I know for a fact that they were and are interested in A.J. Brown. I don't know if a formal offer ever came. My guess is that it didn't. It never got to that point. We did hear reports from other reporters about the Rams. I've heard the same, that there were certainly conversations being held. I just wonder how far those conversations had gotten, and I wonder what they exactly mean. Because I've known Howie Roseman for a long time. I'm not saying we're best friends, but I know how he does business. I know how people around him know that he does business. And I just find it kind of hard to believe that he would have been willing to trade to an NFC rival, when I'd been told, again, at the combine, that and by someone else in the team, that this is going to be an AFC in terms of, trade partners. This is going to be strictly AFC teams. And A.J. Brown understands that in terms of, because they want, at this point, you'd have to have him included in some way and, trying to make him happy to some extent. I don't know if they can go as far as they want in terms of making him happy. And maybe now if he really wants out, he'll have to kind of expand the list of teams that he's willing to go to. But to get back to the Rams, I just don't think Howie Roseman would go through with that. So what is he doing there? Are they trying to create a market and they're using the media to kind of push that? Look, again, I respect every reporter that's NFL reporter. They're all plugged in a lot of times on this stuff, but sometimes I wonder if they, step back and look from the vantage point of okay, does this make sense?
Right. Yeah.
I think the Rams and I think other teams that I've heard possibly have these concerns about A.J. Brown in terms of his knee. This is something I've heard about as far back as the draft. In fact, the Eagles were a team that had a medical, red flag on him because of his knees. And whether this is going to be a chronic issue that eventually at some point it was going to cause issues and shorten his career. And that was part of the reason why the Tennessee Titans moved him, aside from his dissatisfaction with them giving him a contract extension, et cetera. So how does that factor in on whether the teams are as interested in AJ Brown as the Eagles may think they would be, and asking for a 1 and a 2. The other question is like, okay, well, who's going to take AJ Brown's role? Who's going to fill his spot? Devontae Smith, certainly, they think that he has a ceiling that he's yet to reach. But, we'll see a lot by what they do in the draft. And there's always opportunities to trade for guys, et cetera. But like that question really, to me, hasn't been completely answered.
You put your finger on it, Jeff. That to me has always been the core of the entire AJ situation, which is that the Eagles, in everything else they're doing, they are telling you that this season, 2026, will be the last ride for the group of veterans that they have right now on offense. Jalen, Saquon, Devontae, AJ, they even bring Goddard back. They're hoping that Lane can have one more season where he's Lane at right tackle and that Landon Dickerson and Cam Jurgens can stay healthy. And if you're going to trade AJ Brown, are you getting anything in return that can help you right now and make up for his presumed absence? And even a first-round pick or a first and a second-round pick don't provide you any guarantee at all that you're going to get a player who can come in right away and be able to be anything close to what A.J. Brown gives you. And so unless they're going to upset the timeline that they seem to have established for themselves about, how we're going to transition and do all the things we were talking about just a minute ago about turning over some offensive players and getting younger and replenishing the offensive line and the tight end positions, unless they were going to start doing that sooner than we thought or sooner than they've said, it doesn't make sense to move on from AJ. Now, the flip side of that, of course, how does AJ react? How does he carry himself? How does he behave, so to speak, in a season when presumably he doesn't want to be in Philadelphia, but the Eagles didn't move him, didn't get him somewhere else? I've never seen him as a true disruptor, as the kind of disruptive player who can torpedo an entire season. I was around T.O. in 2005. You saw what happened there in the locker room every day and the way he took on Andy Reid and took on Donovan McNabb, Donovan in really some insidious ways. I don't see AJ doing anything like that. For all the distractions that he's caused, they won a Super Bowl. They got to another Super Bowl. He's been a Pro Bowl receiver every single year. He read a book on the sideline. I don't know. What are we talking about here? Are we talking about him burning an entire house down? I don't see it. I just don't.
That's why I think this argument isn't binary. It isn't like, okay, AJ either stays or goes. It's he either stays or goes. But my point is that I don't think it's that black and white in terms of the Eagles probably see a world where they can bring him back. And I'm sure AJ in some way can accept coming back, and then at the same time, I think there's a world obviously that he can be moved. And I, my guess is probably when these conversations are being had publicly, or we know so much that's going in terms of the negotiations or conversations that are being held with other teams, typically the end result is that someone is being moved. You make a good point in terms of bringing back all these guys, one last hurrah, but that's not how Howie thinks. They do want to obviously win a championship next year, but they have to juggle also the long term as well. So I think they try and do both to some extent, and maybe that would be doing both by trading AJ Brown and getting future picks for him. There are ways to again, they can make a trade for a wide receiver at any point, and I think that's eventually what may happen at the safety position, for instance, which hasn't really been filled this offseason, or the outside linebacker or edge rusher position, which they've yet to kind of replace Jalen Phillips. So that can always be done, and Howie Roseman always, I'm sure he'll be saying this next week at the owners' meetings. He'll be saying, this is just the first few innings of this thing. I can do it up until and including in the season. And that may end up be what happens with AJ Brown. But that being said, I think you bring up a great point, and I've talked about this repeatedly. I don't think there's a more loved player in that locker room than AJ. The coaches like him, the franchise likes him in terms of the front office. There's a lot to love about AJ Brown, and he's still a very good player. I think the question though is he a great player, or do they think he'll continue to be a great player? And I think that's part of the equation here that I don't know if everyone has really kind of factored it in to the conversation, because fans view AJ as the AJ of the last 4 years, and maybe not what he will be in the next 4 or at least 2 years in terms of how long he's under contract.